Camera with flash. The Pritchard Clan, a Kentucky covenant. There's a photograph that shouldn't exist. Taken in the winter of 1993, it shows 11 children standing in a cornfield in rural Kentucky. Their faces were hollow, their clothes decades out of time. When authorities arrived at the property, following an anonymous tip, they found something that would shake 3 counties to their core. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't what they discovered that day. It was what they found when they started digging into the family name itself, a name that had been deliberately erased from census records, courthouse files, and local memory. This is the story of the Pritchard Clan, and why, for nearly 7 decades, speaking their name in Harlan County was considered an invitation to something unspeakable. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Derelict House. The homestead discovery. The road to the Pritchard property wasn't on any map. It wound through Daniel Boone National Forest like a scar, rutted and overgrown, the kind of path that existed only because someone had driven it enough times to kill the vegetation beneath. When Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Webb first navigated that road on February 14, 1993, he thought he was responding to a routine welfare check. Someone had called the station, wouldn't give their name, and said children were living in conditions that weren't right. That's the phrase they used, not dangerous, not neglected, just not right. Webb had been with the Harlan County Sheriff's Department for 16 years. He'd seen poverty that would break most people's hearts. Appalachia, Kentucky in the early 90s was bleeding jobs and hope in equal measure, and families were surviving in conditions that urban Americans couldn't fathom. But when he pulled up to the Pritchard homestead that Valentine's Day afternoon, something in his gut twisted in a way it never had before. The house was an architectural contradiction. Parts of it looked antebellum, genuine 19th-century construction with hand-hewn logs and a limestone foundation. Other sections appeared to be additions, but additions from different eras, as if the house had been growing like an organism across decades, never quite matching itself. There was no electricity line running to the property, no satellite dish, no telephone pole, just the house standing in a clearing surrounded by winter-dead cornstalks that rattled in the wind like bones. Webb approached with his partner, Deputy Linda Kowalski, and they could both smell it before they reached the porch. Not decay, exactly, but something older, something like time itself had curdled in that place. The front door was ajar, hanging on leather hinges that looked Civil War-era authentic. And from inside, they could hear children's voices singing something in a round, the kind of song school children might sing, except the melody was wrong. The intervals were off. It sounded like music from a damaged music box. When Deputy Webb pushed the door open, 11 children stopped singing in perfect unison. They stood in what appeared to be a common room, arranged by height, oldest to youngest, spanning what looked like ages 5 to 17. Every single one of them wore clothing that Webb would later describe in his report as period dress from approximately 1920 to 1940. The girls wore long prairie dresses with high collars, the boys wore knickerbockers and suspenders. Their hair was cut in styles Webb's grandmother might have recognized from her childhood photographs, but it was their faces that would haunt him for the rest of his life. They weren't malnourished in the traditional sense. They weren't bruised or obviously injured, but their eyes held something that made Webb think of old Civil War photographs, that distant, 1,000-yard stare that soldiers got after seeing too much death. Except these were children. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5 years old, and she had eyes like someone who'd lived through the Depression and 2 world wars. The eldest boy stepped forward. His name, he said, was Ezekiel Pritchard. He was 17 years old, though something about the way he carried himself seemed far older. He spoke in an Appalachian dialect so thick, so antiquated, that Kowalski would later say it sounded like he was reading from a Steinbeck novel. He told the deputies that their father, Jeremiah Pritchard, was in the back fields tending to the harvest. Their mother had passed, he said, using the old euphemism, when the youngest was born. They had been schooled at home, raised in the old ways, taught to be self-sufficient and God-fearing. Nothing, he said, was technically illegal. Kentucky law permitted homeschooling. Religious isolation wasn't a crime. But Webb couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. He asked Ezekiel when the last time was that any of them had left the property. The boy thought for a long moment, his eyes drifting to the ceiling as if calculating. Then he said something that made Webb's blood run cold. "I believe it was 1947, sir, when my grandfather took some of us to town for the Harvest Festival." It was 1993. The boy was 17. The math didn't work, unless the boy had somehow confused his own memories with family stories, or unless something far stranger was happening on this property, hidden in the folds of the Kentucky mountains, where the outside world rarely looked. Coffin, the graves, and the missing father. Deputy Kowalski made the call that changed everything. While Webb talked with the children, she walked the perimeter of the property, and that's when she found the graves. 73 of them to be exact, arranged in careful rows behind the main house, each marked with a simple wooden cross and a name carved in archaic script. The dates were what made her radio for backup. The earliest grave was marked 1861. The most recent was 1992. But it wasn't just the span of time that disturbed her, it was the pattern. Every gravestone bore the surname Pritchard. And when she started doing the mental arithmetic, she realized that this family had been burying their dead on this property for 132 years without ever reporting a single death to the county. Within 3 hours, the property was swarmed with state police, social services, and a forensic team from Lexington. Jeremiah Pritchard emerged from the back fields as the sun was setting. A tall, gaunt man who looked simultaneously 50 and 80 years old, with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that held no surprise whatsoever at the presence of law enforcement. He didn't resist. He didn't protest. He simply asked, in that same antiquated dialect his children spoke, if he would be permitted to read scripture before they took him away. They allowed it. He gathered his children in the front room, opened a Bible so old its pages were brown and brittle, and read from Deuteronomy about the sins of the fathers being visited upon the children. The children were taken into state custody that night. Social workers who processed them would later report experiencing an overwhelming sense of dread in their presence, though they couldn't articulate why. The children were polite, obedient, and eerily calm. They didn't cry for their father. They didn't ask questions about where they were going. They simply complied, as if they'd been expecting this day their entire lives. One social worker, Patricia Mendes, noted in her report that the children spoke to each other in what sounded like English, but with phrasing so old-fashioned and references so obscure that it was nearly incomprehensible. They talked about things like, the bad summer, and the year the crop screamed, and when grandfather's sin came home. Jeremiah Pritchard was arrested on multiple counts of child endangerment, failure to report deaths, and operating an unlicensed burial ground. But when investigators tried to build a case, they discovered something that should have been impossible. According to every official record they could find, Jeremiah Pritchard didn't exist. There was no birth certificate, no social security number, no record of him attending school, getting married, owning property, or paying taxes. And when they ran the address through historical records, they found something that made the entire investigation grind to a halt. The property had been owned by the Pritchard family since 1859, but according to county records, the last official Pritchard to own the land was a man named Nathaniel Pritchard, who had disappeared in 1928 after being accused of something so disturbing that the courthouse had sealed the records under a judge's order. Scroll unsealing the 1928 documents. The sealed courthouse records became the obsession of Assistant District Attorney Rachel Cleen. She'd been assigned to prosecute Jeremiah Pritchard, but the more she dug into the family history, the more she realized this wasn't a case about neglect or isolation. This was something that reached back through generations, something that had been deliberately hidden by people who understood that certain truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. It took her 6 weeks and a court order to unseal the 1928 documents. What she found inside made her consider dropping the case entirely. Nathaniel Pritchard had been accused of operating what the records called a family in perpetual servitude to an unholy covenant. The language was archaic, almost biblical. But as Clean read through witness testimonies from townspeople who'd visited the property in the 1920s, a pattern emerged that turned her stomach. The Pritchard family, according to multiple sources, had been practicing something that went beyond religious extremism. They had been breeding generationally, intentionally, keeping bloodlines pure and isolated, marrying cousins to cousins, siblings to siblings, all in service of maintaining what Nathaniel Pritchard had called the original bloodline, in his own testimony. But it wasn't just inbreeding that had alarmed the community in 1928. Multiple witnesses reported that the Pritchard children never seemed to age properly, that children who should have been adults were still small, that adults who should have been elderly seemed frozen in time. One witness, a traveling preacher named Reverend Thomas Aldrich, claimed he'd visited the property 3 times over 15 years, and had seen the same children looking exactly the same age each time he visited. His testimony had been dismissed as religious hysteria, but it was compelling enough that the judge had sealed the records and issued a warning that anyone who spoke publicly about the Pritchard family would be held in contempt of court. The case had gone nowhere because Nathaniel Pritchard had vanished before trial, just disappeared into the mountains with his entire family, wife, children, parents, aunts, uncles, and no one had seen them again. The property had been abandoned, or so everyone assumed. The county had tried to seize it for unpaid taxes in 1932, but the surveyor they'd sent up the mountain had returned white-faced and trembling, refusing to ever speak about what he'd seen. After that, people simply stopped going up that road. The property fell off maps. The family name became something you didn't mention, especially among the older folks who remembered. Clean brought her findings to her supervisor, District Attorney James Hardwick, expecting shock or disbelief. Instead, Hardwick closed his office door and told her something that nearly made her quit. His own grandfather had been the judge who'd sealed those records in 1928. And before he died, the old man had told Hardwick's father one thing: the Pritchard family wasn't hiding from the law. The law was hiding them from something else. The children's vigil. The children were separated and placed in different foster homes across 3 counties. It was standard procedure for cases involving potential abuse. But with the Pritchard children, it became something else entirely. Within 2 weeks, every single foster family reported the same phenomena. The children would wake at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning and stand at their windows facing north, toward the old property. They would whisper to each other, even though they were miles apart, separated by mountains and towns. Foster parents would hear their names being called in the middle of the night, not by the Pritchard children in their homes, but by voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The youngest, a girl named Temperance, was placed with a family in Middlesbrough. Her foster mother, Janet Cruz, kept a detailed journal of the experience. On the 4th night, Temperance stopped speaking English entirely. She would only communicate in what Cruz described as bold talk, a dialect so thick and strange that even native Appalachians couldn't fully understand it. She began writing on the walls of her room with her fingers, no pencil, no marker, just her fingertips on the wallpaper, and the words would appear dark and wet, as if the wall itself was bleeding ink. The words were names, hundreds of names, all of them Pritchards, all of them dead. The foster care system made a decision that had never been made before in Kentucky history. They brought all 11 children back together and placed them in a group home in Cumberland, hoping that reuniting them might stabilize whatever psychological trauma they were experiencing. It worked in a sense. The strange phenomena stopped. The middle-of-the-night vigils ceased. The children ate normally, slept normally, and attended the makeshift school classes the state provided. But the staff at the group home reported something that was somehow worse than the supernatural occurrences: the children were waiting. That's the only word the counselors could use to describe it. They were patiently, calmly, inevitably waiting for something to come and take them home. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Shushing faced the ancient dialect. Meanwhile, Jeremiah Pritchard sat in county jail, silent and serene. He took his meals. He read his Bible. He never asked about his children. He never requested a lawyer. When Rachel Clean attempted to interview him, he would only say one thing over and over in that ancient mountain dialect: the covenant keeps what the covenant makes. Blood calls to blood across the hollow years. What was bound in 1859 cannot be unbound by modern law. Clean had the statement analyzed by a linguistics professor at the University of Kentucky who confirmed that Pritchard was speaking in a dialect that had essentially died out by the early 20th century. He shouldn't have known it. No one alive should have known it, unless he'd learned it from people who'd been speaking it for generations in perfect isolation, preserving it like a fossil of language itself. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired librarian named Dorothy Marsh contacted the district attorney's office in April of 1993, 2 months after the children had been found. She was 86 years old, and she said she had information about the Pritchard family that she'd kept secret for nearly 70 years. When Clean met with her in the reading room of the Harlan Public Library, Marsh's hands shook as she pulled out a cardboard box she'd kept hidden in her attic since 1924. Inside were newspapers, letters, and photographs that told a story the county had worked very hard to forget. In 1859, a man named Josiah Pritchard had arrived in Harlan County with his wife, his 3 sons, and a land deed that no one could quite explain. The deed granted him 200 acres in the most remote part of the county, land that was considered cursed by the Cherokee who'd been forced out decades earlier. Josiah was a preacher, but not of any denomination anyone recognized. He held services on his property, and people from town would occasionally attend out of curiosity. Those who went reported that Pritchard preached about bloodlines and covenants, about families chosen by God to endure until the end of days, about sacrifice that echoed through generations like a bell that never stopped ringing. In 1863, during the Civil War, something happened on the Pritchard property that caused the Union Army to station guards on the road leading up the mountain. The official report said they were preventing Confederate sympathizers from using the property as a refuge, but letters from soldiers preserved in Marsh's collection told a different story. They'd been posted there to keep something in, not to keep people out. One soldier, a private named William Tesla, wrote to his wife about hearing children singing at all hours of the night, about seeing figures in the cornfield that would vanish when approached, about the way the Pritchard family would emerge from their house during thunderstorms and stand in the lightning with their arms raised, speaking words that made the soldiers' ears bleed. After the war, the family retreated deeper into isolation. But every generation, someone from town would make the mistake of going up that mountain. A traveling salesman in 1879, a census taker in 1891, a school teacher in 1903 who'd heard there were children up there who needed educating. Some came back changed, speaking in whispers about things they'd seen, about how the family never seemed to age right, about how the children's eyes were old and knowing in ways that human eyes shouldn't be. Others never came back at all. Their disappearances were never investigated. There was an unspoken agreement in Harlan County: the Pritchard family was the price you paid for living in these mountains. You didn't talk about them. You didn't think about them. And you certainly didn't speak their name after dark. Dorothy Marsh had been 17 years old in 1924 when her older brother, Samuel, had gone up to the Pritchard property on a dare. He'd returned 3 days later, walking down Main Street in clothes that looked like they belonged to his grandfather, speaking in a dialect that had been dead for 50 years. He lived for 6 more months, getting older by the day, aging years in the span of weeks until he died looking like a man of 90, though he was only 18. The doctors called it progeria, a rapid aging disease. But Marsh knew better. Her brother had told her in his final days what the Pritchards really were, what they'd been doing on that mountain for generations, and why no one who knew the truth would ever speak their name. Musical notes: The Covenant endures. On May 3, 1993, all 11 Pritchard children vanished from the group home in Cumberland. There was no break-in, no sign of forced exit. The overnight staff reported checking on them at 2 o'clock in the morning, and all 11 were asleep in their beds. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the beds were empty and perfectly made, the corners tucked with military precision. The only thing left behind was a note written in that same archaic script, pinned to the wall of the oldest boy's room. It said, "The covenant keeps what the covenant makes. We go home to wait our turn." Search parties combed the mountains for 3 weeks. They found nothing, not a footprint, not a piece of torn clothing, not a single trace that 11 children had walked out of a locked facility and disappeared into the Kentucky wilderness. But hikers and hunters began reporting something else. At night, if you were anywhere near that old abandoned road that led to the Pritchard property, you could hear singing. Children's voices performing that same strange round that Deputy Webb had heard on Valentine's Day, the melody that sounded like a music box wound too tight and playing at the wrong speed. Rachel Clean made one final attempt to get answers. She visited Jeremiah Pritchard in jail and told him his children were gone. She expected relief or panic or grief. Instead, he smiled for the first time since his arrest. He told her that his children had gone where they'd always belonged, back to the land that held the bones of their ancestors, back to the covenant that had been made in 1859 when his great-great-grandfather had traded something precious for the promise of eternity. He said the family would endure long after America crumbled, long after the mountains themselves wore down to dust, because they'd been given a gift that most people were too afraid to accept. They'd been given forever, and all it cost was everything. Jeremiah Pritchard died in custody on June 15, 1993. The coroner ruled it natural causes, though the man had been in perfect health the day before. His body was never claimed. The state buried him in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery, as far from his family's land as possible. The property itself was finally seized by the county and designated as protected wilderness. No development, no logging, no public access. The official reason was environmental protection. The real reason, whispered among county officials, was that some places needed to be left alone. Some doors once open should never be closed, because you don't want to trap yourself inside with what's on the other side. The Pritchard children were never found. They remain to this day on missing persons lists in Kentucky, though no active investigation continues. Every few years, someone claims to see them, always at night, always near that old property, always wearing those same period clothes, always singing. The oldest boy, Ezekiel, would be 48 years old now if he aged normally. But those who claim to have seen him say he looks exactly as he did in 1993, 17 years old, eyes like photographs from a war that never ended. Dorothy Marsh died in 1995. In her will, she left instructions that her collection of Pritchard materials be destroyed, burned, scattered. Her executor, a lawyer named Marcus Webb, yes, the same deputy who'd found the children, honored that request. He burned every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence that the Pritchard family had been anything more than a footnote in Appalachian history. But before he did, he made copies. He kept them in a safe deposit box with instructions that they be opened only if the Pritchard name ever surfaced again. Because Webb understood something that most people don't want to accept. Some families aren't bound by biology or law or time. Some families are bound by something older, something that was here before we named these mountains, something that will be here long after our civilization is a layer of compressed sediment beneath forests we can't imagine. The Pritchard family made a covenant in 1859. And covenants, unlike people, don't die. They wait. They endure. They keep what they make across generations, across centuries, calling blood back to blood in voices that sound like children singing in a cornfield at midnight under stars that have been watching this same performance since before America was born. In Harlan County, Kentucky, there's still a road that doesn't appear on maps. And if you're foolish enough to follow it, if you're curious enough to walk up that mountain on a night when the moon is dark and the corn is high, you might hear them, 11 children singing a song in a round, the melody wrong and ancient and patient. They're still there. They're still waiting. And they'll be waiting long after you and I are dust. Because that's what the covenant promised them. That's what they paid for. That's why even now, even after everything that's been revealed, people in Harlan County still won't speak the Pritchard name after dark. Because some families don't end. They just go quiet for a while, waiting for the next generation to wander up that mountain and learn what their great-grandparents knew, that some doors should never have been opened. And once they are, they can never truly be closed.